14 doctors had stopped saying the word hope. They had run tests until the machines hummed with exhaustion, called in specialists until names blurred into schedules, and still the infant in the white crib, Michael, kept burning with a fever that no chart could explain. Money had bought them second opinions and private wings and every scanner that science could offer, but money had not bought the answer. The house on Victoria Island gleamed like a small city, marble reflecting sunlight, chefs and chauffeurs moving through it with quiet efficiency. Yet inside one nursery, the air smelled faintly of something sour, something that hid in corners and behind toys. It smelled like a secret. David Thompson, who had been accustomed to problems solving themselves as soon as he signed the check, learned the new shape of powerlessness in the creased planes of his face. He had paid 50 million naira in fees and tests. He had placed calls that made men listen on the other side of the world. 14 doctors had pronounced concern, treatment, watchful waiting, and then finally, admission. They did not know. The 15th man, a pediatrician from abroad, had been tender but clear. We have exhausted current diagnostics. If his symptoms continue, we need to consider environmental factors. The doctors had never been unkind. They had been doctors, measured, professional, constrained by the spaces they were trained to look at. What the doctors had not done, in all the bright rooms and sterile corridors, was to lay hands on the places where the child slept. Grace sat nights on the edge of Michael's crib, fingers tangled in the white blanket, eyes rimmed red from fever nights and silent prayers. She knew the luxury of the house like the lines on her palms, but when the baby cried, she felt like a stranger in her own life. The monitors clicked, the staff whispered. Everything that once meant security, doors that opened, staff that obeyed, doctors who arrived on call, now felt useless. At 3 in the morning, when the mansion slept but the baby did not, Grace would press her face to Michael's and whisper what she had begun to pray without form. Find him. Please find him. On a day heavy with Lagos heat, a day when the sky sat low and the city seemed to press inward, David had gone out because sitting in his office did nothing for the heavy fear at his chest. Traffic on the bridge was a slow, rumbling thing. Cars lined up like a congregation. The air smelled of exhaust, of hot tar, the faint, bright sting of petrol and frying oil from a distant street vendor. He had intended only to clear his head. That was when the image occurred to him. A small boy, barefoot, with a carefulness about him that did not belong to the noise around him. The boy was crouched beside an old woman near the railing, hands busy with leaves and water, his face a study of concentration. David's driver hesitated at the sight of the child. The old woman's hand looked better than before. There was a slow closing of a wound, a pale scab retreating under the boy's careful touch. Something about the way he worked. Soft fingers, the way he smelled the leaves, the attentiveness in his eyes, caught David like a cold wind. He watched the boy cup a small, steaming bundle, then press a leaf to the old woman's shoulder. She smiled with a kind of surprised relief and patted the boy's arm. Traffic thawed and then thickened. David watched the boy as the city joked itself into motion around them, a hawker's chant, the whine of a motorcycle, the distant cut of laughter from someone who had no idea of what had happened inside the Thompson house. The boy's clothes were threadbare, his feet were dirty, his hair cropped uneven. He looked like every street child in the city, and at the same time he did not. There was a patient steadiness about him, the familiarity of a person who had spent long hours learning how small things could matter. Curiosity pulled at David until it became something braver. He had done some strange things for his son already. He stepped out of the car, something the driver protested, and walked toward the bridge. He did not go as a rich man stepping into a poor world. He went with the weary humility of a father who had tried everything he knew to do. The boy's name was Peter. He said it like a modest thing, hands folded into each other as if the name might slide away. He told David simply that his grandmother had taught him. Grandmother had been the keeper of small remedies and patient ways, how to boil bark without burning away its smell, how to know a leaf by the way it snapped between the fingers, which roots were bitter for reasons that made them useful. Peter spoke of teaching as if he had inherited a language rather than money. No swagger, no theatrics, only the soft certainty of someone who had seen things work. The old woman, whose face had been a map of years, recognized something too. She pressed Peter's palm, and then turned to David with gratitude so plain it made his throat hurt. David felt something he had not felt in weeks. A sudden, irrational hope. He did not know this child. He did not know if grandmother's leaves worked against fevers or toxins. He only knew that he had tried everything the bank account would allow, and the answer had not come. He brought Peter home. The mansion absorbed the boy with a kind of stunned silence. Staff murmured in doorways. Grace, when she first saw him, had the lightning flash of protective panic. Who was this child at their table? He smelled of bridge dust and boiled leaves. He had been scrubbed and clothed out of decency rather than style. He ate jollof rice as if something in it reminded him of hunger's more honest shape. He cradled the spoon like someone who had learned to take sustenance seriously. David told Grace about the old woman and the boy's steady hands. She listened, arms folded, grief like a thin, relentless rain across her face. Desperation can make people do unexpected things. Sometimes it makes them do the right ones. Peter's first encounter with Michael was quiet. He moved around the nursery like a man who had been allowed into a chamber filled with secrets. He watched the monitors, his face unreadable. He did not question the doctor's instruments or dismiss their knowledge. He examined the baby in a different way. He watched where the air hung. He followed the smell that did not belong. He knelt and lifted a small plastic toy from the corner. Behind it, in a shadow that never met the sunshine the room offered, there was a blackness that looked at first like a stain, and then settled into a pattern Peter's eyes recognized. It was mold, dark, thin, feathery, clinging to plaster like a memory no one wanted. He put his hand to his nose. The smell was sallow, like bread left too long in damp air, like the inside of an old cupboard. Peter's grandmother had taught him to notice the smell of rooms as if they spoke. Sometimes the house keeps sickness, he told them in a voice that was not quite a question. Sometimes the air is not clean. No one had thought to check the walls. The doctors had checked the child, his blood, his lungs. They had not been invited to look behind where toys hid. It was not malice. It was a truth of expertise. A clinician looks for disease in the body. Sometimes the body's enemy lived in a place no one had considered. The revelation changed the house. It reframed months of anxiety into a new, sensible line of action. The child was moved to a different room with wide windows. The nursery's curtains opened like a confession, and sunlight found corners that had been living in polite shadow. The walls were aired, scrubbed. Paint was stripped where the blotches had spread. Peter refused the idea that a single act would do it. He spoke of routine, of patience, of watching. He spoke with the authority of someone who had watched how small, repeated things corrected great damage. What Peter also gave was something the family had lost: rhythm. He made a small schedule printed not in charts, but in the cadence of the house. 3 times a day he prepared a simple herbal preparation, carefully without fanfare. He did not claim it would fix everything. He spoke enough to make it clear he honored doctors. He spoke also enough to insist that the body sometimes needed the environment to change so it could heal. He placed small, cool compresses on Michael's chest. He massaged with a paste that had the smell of crushed green leaves and a faint bitter note, something that came from a grandmother's memory, not from a manual. David watched, at first skeptical, then with the slow softening of a man who had been bereft of belief for too long. Days felt both cramped and expanded. The house moved through time in a new rhythm, boiling water clinking in the kitchen, steam rising against the pale morning light, Peter's hands working with the disciplined slowness of a craftsman, monitors still clicking, but with a beat that was less threatening. Grace hovered, wanting to believe but trained by disappointment not to let herself be carried away. The staff took to the new routine with dutiful curiosity. Even the doctors, when they were invited back to observe the changed environment, peered closely with sober faces. None claimed the boy's remedies were a panacea. They nodded instead to what Peter had done that day. He had found a plausible environmental source where none had been checked. The first day passed with little visible change. At night, the monitors still hummed. Michael's brow cooled and then warmed. The caretakers slept in chairs like shadows. The second morning came thin and bright. Grace, exhausted, leaned over the crib and felt the baby's breath. He opened his eyes. They were small and surprised and then fixed on her face with a new clarity. It was the smallest triumph, the kind that detonates quietly. A blink, a shift in color, an easing of the taut line at the corner of a mouth. They let out a sound that had been waiting for relief so long it felt like a kind of new language. On the third day, Michael smiled. The smile was the event that made the house exhale. David, who had been watching from a doorway where his expression had become a study in disbelief and then gratitude, sank to his knees and placed his hands on the floor, as if he needed to feel solidity under his palms. He did not kneel in worship to wealth or to his own power. He bowed there to something that had re-entered his life. Hope. He thanked whatever had answered his prayer that night. His gratitude was messy and whole, hands held in the air, tears tracking down professional cheekbones, the sound of a man emptied and then filled again. Peter watched without triumph. He kept his eyes steady, and when David came to him, the billionaire found himself awkward and sincere. He offered anything: money, a mansion, a name, and a foundation. Peter listened and then, with the soft, decisive honesty of a boy who had known hunger in more than one sense, said one thing: school. He wanted books. He wanted a place where knowledge was not a secret kept by those with the means to buy it, but something he could hold and wield. David did not expect the request. He glanced at Grace, whose eyes had gone round with relief and something like admiration. He reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. In that motion, he understood how trivial the gesture would be against the boy's life. Instead, he made a promise. He offered scholarship, a place in a school near the university, and a plan to ensure Peter could study as long as he wished. He said it with the calm practicality that had built companies and set markets on their rails. "I'll make sure you get the education you ask for." Peter's face shifted then, from the guardedness of someone wary of promises to the open, unembellished gratitude of someone who had once learned to trust only by small earned proofs. The story did not end with a smile in a nursery. It moved, as truths do, into broader light. David called a meeting with a team at the University of Lagos. He had learned to measure his astonishment with the rigorous temper of a businessman. The university researchers were circumspect when they stepped into the Thompson nursery, now scrubbed and sunlit. They sampled, they documented, they spoke in the patient qualifiers of science. Preliminary tests showed compounds in some of the plant components Peter used that, under laboratory conditions, interacted with certain toxins associated with mold. The scientists were careful in how they framed the findings. These were early results that suggested possible activity. Much more work was required to translate such findings into clinical practice. That cautionality pleased David. It meant the boy's instincts would not be mythologized into false promises. It meant the knowledge could be verified and possibly shared more widely. The media, hungry for a narrative where wealth met humility and lives were altered, ran the story with the grain that held all its parts together. But inside the house, action continued in more practical ways. David did not simply hand over a check and wash his hands of the problem. He financed an inspection program for neighboring homes, arranged for professional remediation for those who had mold issues, and insisted on housing for the old woman Peter had treated on the bridge. She moved into a small, dignified apartment paid for by a trust, where she could see the bridge from her window without sleeping under it. The household staff received training about home environment health. They learned to look at the house as if it could keep or give sickness. Peter's life shifted along the trajectory he had asked for. Classes replaced street corners, uniforms replaced threadbare shirts, books replaced the leaves his grandmother had kept in a small sack. He kept the rhythm of attention he had always had, the hands that had healed now learning the hand of a pen, the attention he had used on wounds now learning anatomy and chemistry. He did not take gifts with the casualness of a child used to being given. He took education like a tool, and he used it like a key. 3 months later, the house on Victoria Island rang with a different sound. It was not the same raucous laughter of careless feast. It was gentler, the kind of chaotic joy that comes from children who are well. Michael chasing a toy across tiles, his small laughter bright and clear. Peter watching with a teacher's proud chin. Grace and David hosting a meal of jollof rice and stewed beef, a simple, fragrant dish that tasted of home and for them of survival. Outside, the bridge remained the bridge. Cars, conversations, the city pressing onward. Inside, the house held its quiet renewal. The University of Lagos published a cautious report. Preliminary findings suggested that some compounds identified from the plant combination Peter had used showed activity in neutralizing certain mold-derived toxins in controlled experiments. The language was careful. The scientists stressed the need for further research and clinical trials before any broad claims could be made. That caution did not make the family's gratitude less real. It made the validation responsible. It turned a moment of domestic salvation into a possible lesson for others, if only they would look beyond the obvious. David's philanthropy took a shape that was not headline fishing. He set up a small foundation focused on environmental health in homes and education scholarships for talented youth from the streets. The program sent teams into neighborhoods with teams trained to inspect and remediate mold, to teach basic ventilation and cleaning practices, and to connect people with affordable services. Peter was a figurehead, not as a spectacle but as a teacher. He taught how to notice, how to listen to rooms the way some people listen to each other. And he taught students that wisdom did not always wear a suit. The old woman, whose name was Auntie Kemi, kept a pot of stew in the new apartment and sent Peter small pieces of paper folded into her palm. A recipe, a note, a blessing. She came to the house for dinner and sat at the head of the table, laughed loudly when Michael smeared jollof across his face and told stories of rainy seasons and herbs that smelled like rain. Her presence was a gentle stitch that connected the bridge to the house. There were small public lessons, too. The family's story inspired a campaign about environmental checks for infants at home. Local clinics began to ask about living conditions as a part of initial assessments. Doctors who had once felt a strange humility at the edge of their instruments found themselves in conversations about integrating environmental inspectors into care teams. No one pretended that every mystery would be solved by leaves in a pot. The narrative that took hold was more modest and more useful. Sometimes the diagnosis lies not just in the body, but in the house that holds it. In private, David changed in ways that had less to do with press releases and more to do with how he spent mornings. He learned to walk the compound at dawn, to look at walls the way he had once looked at balance sheets. He learned to ask questions he had previously delegated. Once, on a low, bright morning, he sat with Peter under the shade of a small tree and listened to him speak about his grandmother. Peter talked about the way she taught him to look at roots, not to pull them from the ground, but to understand why they held fast. David listened and found that there was a lesson in that for business and for life. Roots mattered. The final image of the story returned to the motif that had opened it. A bridge, but changed. Michael and Peter played near its base one afternoon, their small silhouettes easy and full. The city rolled around them, uncaring in the way cities are, but the children laughed with a kind of defiant lightness. David stood nearby, one hand shielding the sun from his eyes, and Grace brought a plate of jollof. The old woman watched, her face lined but relaxed. The house had not been cured into a fairy tale of endless riches. It had been altered in a truer way, by humility, curiosity, the willingness to listen to a child who had learned from a grandmother's wisdom, and the practical follow-through of a man who had learned to direct his wealth toward repair. If there is a single thing that felt like the heart of the matter, it was this. Expertise and experience can sit beside one another. A diagnosis could be complete and still blind to its surroundings. Wealth could open doors but could not replace the humility of noticing. And sometimes the person who notices is the one who has nothing to lose but everything to teach. When the cameras had stopped filing in, when the lab results were printed and placed in binders in offices that understood careful claims, the family settled into a life that had a new rhythm. Michael grew up without the shadow that had once clung to his crib. Peter went to school and then university, and later, when he stood before a group of young students, he would not speak of miracles so much as of attention. Sometimes, he would say, you have to smell a room like someone who has been taught to listen to houses. Sometimes the smallest hands see the things the largest machines do not. The last shot the story gave was of sunlight moving across the mansion's tiles, catching the dust motes like tiny ships. Laughter, two children's laughter, bounced against the walls. David watched them and felt a kind of relief that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being part of a human exchange that had returned what had been lost. Health, yes, but also dignity, curiosity, and the knowledge that sometimes the answer to a problem lived where people least expected to look. If this story moved you, share it with someone who should hear it and tell us in the comments. What did you take from Peter's quiet attention?